So are there common issues with the F-Type R Jaguar? Of course there are. Let's get into it. Today we're actually going to dive in to what some of those issues actually really are that pop up on these cars. Now, it's not always typically every car. A lot of these problems maybe afflicts 1 in 10. Maybe some of these problems are 1 in 20. Maybe some of these problems are 1 in 100 cars. Regardless, they're the most common problems identified with owning an F-Type R. So let's get into some of those key areas, and hopefully you can make a decision whether you want to take on that level of risk. I've watched the videos, I've read the forums. Honestly, between that and what I've experienced myself, I'm going to share with you some of the key areas, recalls, and problems with these F-Types. Now, before you guys think I'm just getting nitpicky about the Jaguar F-Type, I'm really not. As a matter of fact, these cars are so good, I really can't think of a car I'd rather have right now, other than maybe a new McLaren 720S, and we're working on that. But beyond that, these cars are spectacular, and they're really some of the nicest, coolest cars on the road. They make great sounds and look awesome. But every single brand has its issues. Think about the Porsche 911. They've had a lot of issues with the IMS bearing issues. They've had rubber center clutch problems in the early Porsches. They've had a lot of issues, oil leaks. I mean, the list goes on and on. How about Audi? Burning oil. How about broken timing chains? Audis have no shortage of issues too, and Benz, of course, have their issues. They have a lot of problems with, say, even the self-leveling systems, air ride, problems like that. Lots of issues in almost every brand. We don't even get me started on Ford, where you talk about issues with the cars burning down. How about Ferrari? Cars that burn down. How about Lamborghini and their weak clutches? But we're not here to pick about this, because they all bring something cool to the table, and that's as well what the F-Type does too. But I'm just going to walk you guys through that. So let's get started on one of the first things I've noticed. It's actually happened to me, and it's actually on the list of things that seem to pop up from time to time. And it's this area right in here. So if you'll notice, you've actually got there's some scratches there. It's hard to see, but if I go this way, maybe you can see it a little better. There's scratches along that whole section there. But what causes that? That's actually the seal in here. And apparently you can take the car into Jaguar and they'll replace that seal, and then of course it removes the problem. But the problem is that seal is tight and you get rocks and pebbles in there, and the window opens and closes and those pebbles grind against the glass. And looking at mine, I actually have some here that I can actually feel with my finger, like it's actually carved a bit of a groove in my glass. And this isn't uncommon. This is actually a fairly common issue. So there is an issue with that. Of course, you want to make sure you can get that seal changed out. Apparently it's a different seal, revised, that reduces that issue. Now, another problem with these cars is the rear differential. Now, they're electronic differentials and they have been known to fail. They're a little fragile, particularly if you're tracking the car. Electronic, not as robust as some of the other differentials on the market. So if you start to drive it really, really hard, there could be problems. As well with the differential, they tend to leak. That's not an uncommon problem too. People are starting to see issues with leaks. If they leak, it's usually just a seal, not the end of the world. Just make sure that you're taking it to a reputable shop, or hopefully the dealer, because if you over tighten the fittings after the fact, you can actually end up ruining the differential. Make sure it's installed properly with all the respective and proper torque settings, as well as the proper procedure. Now, these Jags are amazing and they've got a lot of great moving parts, but with those moving parts sometimes come squeaks and rattles, and owners have noticed some problems with certain areas. Now, every time you unlock and lock the door, the mirrors actually toggle in and out. Now, those can have, on small occurrences, become a problem. This here can start to fail. I mean, it moves every single time. Now, I've got this key in my hand, but I'm going to put it back in my pocket. And then, because I have it, you can go like this, and it unlocks the door. That's great. And then we go around here, and then we can lock it again. Just give it a push, and it locks. Notice that? And then we hit this again, and it opens. Then we open the door, climb on in, and then you start the car. But when you hit this, you have this vent that rises. It's pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie, that is a really cool feature. But that has been known as an issue for a few people, where it only comes up maybe halfway, doesn't come up all the way like this, or it just stops to fail. I gotta expect over time you're gonna hear about more and more stories where this stops working. Why? Because there's mechanics in here that move that thing up and down. Likely that will be a failure point at some point in the life of the car. I don't know what that means. if you have to disassemble part of the dashboard or if this piece has to come out, but you got to know that that would probably be a little bit of a pricey fix. So we'll turn it back off, and then of course it drops right back down. But on top of that, people have commented about squeaks and rattles in the car starting to develop. But I would think that that's going to be a part of the life of any rigid sports car. I mean, this car is rigid, and my car doesn't squeak at all. I've got 30,000 miles, there are about 50,000 kilometers on it. Not a squeak in sight. I mean, knocking on wood, of course. But there have been people commenting about that, and I would imagine if you start pounding out those rough roads, depends where you live, if you're on a lot of cobblestone, we have a lot of potholes, I would imagine that starts loosening things up. But there's been lots of comments about squeaks and rattles. So there's another relatively common problem, and fortunately it's not a whole lot of money, and it has to do with the exhaust. Now you look down here, beautiful quad exhaust, particularly on the R and the SVR have the 4 tailpipes, and the S has the 2 in the middle. But there is what they call an active exhaust system. So in other words, with the flick of a switch on the dashboard, you can actually change the tone. So default is quiet, startup is full open, and then of course dynamic mode is full open. However, when you're normally running in default mode, it is actually closed and the car sounds a little quieter until you're in full throttle at higher revs. So basically, that valve can actually stick open. It's known to stick open, wide open, meaning it's going to be loud all the time. Now, it's not an expensive repair, but it is a problem. So I'll give you a demonstration what it sounds like with the valves open and closed. So in stock format, and dynamic mode. Now apparently there's also a fitment problem, and it's not something that even the dealer can really work out. It's more of a self-management situation, and that is panel gaps. If you look at these cars, a lot of times you see this big hood. You've got the kind of the 3-dimensional hood going on here. You've got the side, the top, and it's such a large panel that often closing it results in a tight gap here, a big gap there, maybe sometimes. If you look down here, you'll notice this doesn't align. This isn't square either. It's actually one sticks out a little more than the other. And here it's good, but there it's not. We look around here and you can see it actually sticks out quite a bit here, and then here it's kind of pulled in. So this doesn't fit all that well sometimes. But apparently there's a solution for that for the most part, other than continuing trying to readjust it. You can actually, when you close it, instead of closing it from one side, which is kind of the norm, you feel like, because the hood drops down, you feel like you got to close it from one side or the other. That creates sort of the twisting, and then you wind up with that uneven panel gap. There is actually a way to fix that. You use both hands at the same time and push down on it evenly. And with time, that starts to create that evenness across the board. It may not work the first time, but it often will straighten things out more eventually. So that's the way you mitigate it yourself. And so yes, there's yet another problem that seems to creep up in more and more of these forums. Let's take a look, I'll explain. So we've got the hood up. What you have here, of course, you've got the supercharger, which you can see is tucked underneath all this big plastic. Plastic is more just for looks, but it's the supercharger, it can fail. That's less of the issue than the actual snorkel. So at the front end of the supercharger, you have the snorkel and basically the pulley that's driven off the engine. The crank turns a belt, which then turns the pulley, and of course that ties into your supercharger. Well, the problem with that is there's an isolating coupler that's tied right after the snorkel into the supercharger that's known to get sloppy, loose. Now what that usually means is it starts to rattle and make noises. Sometimes you'll hear it when you turn the car off. You shut the ignition off, and then you'll start to hear a little clunk clunk, and you'll hear a little bit of a knock as you turn the car off, or you'll just hear a little bit of a scraping or kind of a dragging or rattling noise. May not be really obvious at first, but that is a common symptom of the isolating coupler. Is it the end of the world? I guess eventually with time will tell if we see more and more cases and what it actually results in. Does it create damage within the engine, or does it just become more of an annoyance? Wait and find out. But that is something that needs to be rectified by the dealer for sure. So what about recalls? Yes, the Jaguar F-Type R actually, and many of the F-Types have safety recalls, like every other brand pretty much out there on the planet has had recalls of some type, and that's to address safety concerns. The SVR specifically, lower control arms at the back, not fastened properly, obviously result in loss of control if it comes apart, and the rest is history. I think we all know what can happen there. Another recall is when we look inside here, pop the door, it's the sensors. There's a sensor detecting who's sitting in the seat. Is it a child? Is it an adult? And the modules potentially could have been miswired, which means that it doesn't know the difference between a child or an adult. As a matter of fact, if you have a little child in there, it has to detect a certain weight. You don't want the airbags to deploy in a case of an accident because it can lethally injure a small person. But if there's a heavy adult that it senses a 250-pound adult sitting in there, then it definitely wants to deploy the airbag. But there's some miswiring in the sensors, of course, that detects that and the weight of the individual sitting in the seat, and so that has to be potentially rewired. Now there's another recall regarding the wheels. Not the 20-inch, not the 19s, but the 18-inch wheels. For those few cars out there that have 18-inch wheels fitted to them from the factory, there's a discrepancy with what the placard says in here. Because when you pop the driver's door, you'll notice the placard here actually does state the type of wheels that should be on there. Well, it's incorrect. And it doesn't comply with certain regulations, so that has to be sorted out as well. There's also another afflicted recall on certain model years, and not only unique to the F-Type, but as well there are other Jags, so you'd have to check that recall out. But it actually has to do with accessory belt in the front. It's the accessory belt or power steering or battery cable. The pulley belts can come loose, break, come detached, and if that starts ripping around in there, can cause other problems. Loss of steering and potential for crash. Obvious end result, need I say more, but there are possibilities of that being an issue, and of course that's got to be dealt with if your vehicle falls under one of those particular model years. Now I guess there's another recall, and it has to do with this. That's the signal lights. That what can actually happen is if there's a burnt out light on the same side, in theory it's actually designed, vehicles are supposed to blink at a different speed. So in other words, this is supposed to go faster if there's a burnt out light on this side. That's actually a signal to the driver. It's not by accident. That is actually regulated that way. And currently there are cars that does not work on. So if you had a failed fixture on a signal light on this side, for example, you should have it faster blinking, but they have to verify that. That has to be rectified by Jaguar. So again, as I say, every vehicle has issues. Think about if you bought a BMW, you know you have plastic fitting issues. You'll have coolant leaks and oil leaks. So there's no shortage of issues there. And Audis, of course, with their burning oil. And again, as I mentioned, timing chains that can come unglued, blowing up the engine. You can also have issues. Even a Lexus has issues. There have been problematic transmissions as well. Let's not forget about their crappy infotainment system that just doesn't work properly either. And there's other squeaks and rattles. I've also heard of melting dashboards in Lexus and shattering sunroofs. So they're not without their flaws as well. Every single brand has issues, and I still can't tell you enough about how good this car really is, and the fact that I don't think I would buy another car at this time. We'll see as time goes on, but honestly, these are magnificent machines, and you can't go too wrong with an F-Type Jag. So hope you enjoyed it, guys. If you did, be sure to click on that and check out the first day that I brought this bad boy home. You're gonna love it. Great video, lots of fun to watch. Hope to see you in the next one. Catch you then. Bye-bye.